Hello, everyone. I'm animator Mark Kausler. You're listening to the Skull Rock Podcast.
Skull Rock Podcast is brought to you by the generosity of the following companies. The Old Mill Press, publishing beautifully crafted books that illuminate our world. To learn more, visit theoldmillpress.com. And by listeners like you.
Aye, mateys, remember this as the day you sailed with the Skull Rock Podcast. Proceed at your own risk, and mark well me words, mateys. Dead men tell no tale.
Welcome back to yet another edition of Skull Rock Podcast, the show about all things Disney and pop culture. Every week we take you behind the scenes of some of your favorite Disney films, theme park attractions, performances, books, music, as well as what's streaming, what's in theaters, and what's happening in this multiverse of entertainment. I'm Aljon, your lifelong Disney, Marvel, Star Wars fan and pop culturist, and you can email me, Aljon, A-L-J-O-N, at skullrockpodcast.com.
And I'm Dave Bossert, artist, filmmaker, and author, and welcome to the Skull Rock Podcast. If you love Disney and pop culture, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can also like and follow us on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, LinkedIn, and on our Skull Rock YouTube channel. Yeah. You can also email me at dave@skullrockpodcast.com.
All right, Dave, another awesome interview is planned for today, and who do we have?
You know what? We've got Bruce Reitherman. Bruce Reitherman is the son of Wooly Reitherman, one of Walt Disney's 9 old men. Yeah. Bruce is a documentarian, but it also was the voice of Mowgli in the Jungle Book.
Amazing.
And Christopher Robin.
I love it. I can't believe it.
So Bruce is going to chat with us for the next 2 weeks. So we're dropping part 1 today.
Awesome. We'll sit back and relax and check out Bruce right here on Skull Rock Podcast.
Let's chat.
Let's chat.
So let's chat now.
Let's chat afterwards. And he said, let's chat again.
Skull Rock Podcast. Interview time.
Well, Aljon, we've got another fantastic guest this week. We've got Bruce Reitherman, who is a documentarian, an actor, a biologist, an environmentalist, a wildlife biologist, and a land conservancy guy. I think I've covered the whole spectrum, haven't I, Bruce?
You don't have time enough to add anything else to that. I think that's adequate for starters.
Well, I want to welcome you to the Skull Rock Podcast, and I also want our listeners to know, if you think the last name sounds a little familiar, Bruce is the son of one of Walt's 9 old men, legendary Wooly Reitherman, legendary animator at the Disney Studios. Bruce, I don't even know where to begin other than to say, let's start with what I always ask all of my guests, all of our guests that come on the show. It's a similar question. How did you get started into film? And more importantly, I think you've got to sort of touch on the fact that your dad was at the Disney Studios. So from your earliest memories, you probably, Disney, you've been a Disney family.
Yeah, well, so that's a great place to start because it allows me to do 2 or 3 things all at once. You did indeed bury the lead there a bit. My most notable association with anything related to Disney is that my dad was the famous Wooly Reitherman animator from not the very, very earliest days of the Disney studio, but about the time that Snow White was being developed. Dad came on at the studio there as a young man in his early 20s, in the mid 30s, and then worked there all the way through to the early 80s ultimately as a director and a producer for 15 years after Walt had passed away. So with that, as something we can come back to in a second, I'll answer the question that you posed to me more directly, which is to suggest then that with Dad being that part of the Disney family, the Disney institutional corporate family, that was quite a cozy place to work. Had a very family kind of environment. I was involved at Disney, from my earliest days. My mom used to especially if it was if a hot afternoon in the late summer, or she'd remind me that she took me to Disneyland for opening day, but I was still a couple of months from being born. I wasn't born until September, and Disneyland opened in July, as I recall, or something like that, early August. And so she was quite uncomfortable at the time. And as a result of that, I like to think of myself as probably one of the very youngest people to have visited Disneyland on its opening day in that way. And that kind of carried through the rest of our lives. My life, I've got a couple older brothers, but we were always kind of around things Disney, although we had a very separate life from that as young kids as well. Lived in a kind of a typical suburban kind of really pleasant little neighborhood. You know, our weekends and things were occupied with our dad taking us to Little League baseball games and swim meets. And, you know, we had a pool in the backyard, and friends would come over. We had a very normal sort of non-Hollywood, by whatever standards you stereotype the Hollywood lifestyle. But ours was very, kind of quotidian, quintessentially, a lot of Q words. American, just kind of a very suburban 1960s kind of upbringing.
And I'd imagine, and really this is just me having talked to a lot of the old timers, I'd imagine that when you say you had sort of a regular upbringing, Disney back in the 50s and 60s was, Uncle Walt on television and Disneyland. It's not the sort of global brand that it is today. Am I right in that?
Yes, I think that is true for sure. And, things that are, wholesome on the outside aren't necessarily vanilla ice cream all the way through to the middle. And, Disney had the corporate, or not the corporate so much, but the studio environment, the filmmaking environment. I mean, it's a diverse place full of hundreds of people. Several hundred people were involved in most of the animated features. So there's plenty of room for diversity of opinion and different ways of looking at the world there. But in general, it was people got along. And it was, unlike what you might think of a lot of Hollywood sort of homes, we didn't really hang out a whole lot with other Disney families. We had, our friends from school. That's the way it is when you have kids. As parents, you become friends with your kids' friends' parents, right? So you're in the PTA or whatever, and that's where you make your new relationships that are going to drive your friendships forward for the next 15, 20 years with the family. And that's how we grew up. And that doesn't mean that we didn't do a lot of fun things at Disney. We can get into more detail about how my brothers and I Dad would take us down there for a couple hours on Saturdays when he was working on something. But generally, we had a life that was I don't think it was all that different from the other kids we grew up with, except that Dad went to work at a place that was very much unlike where most other kids' parents went to work.
I was going to say, like, you might have had a friend down the street whose dad was an insurance guy, and, somebody.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had, the kid at the house caddy corner across the street, Lockheed guy. Burbank had 2 or 3 different industries that had hired and employed a lot of people at that time. But yeah, very much you'd the other parents of the grade school we went to, all over the map in a really interesting way. It wasn't, sometimes people think of that 1960s era, late 50s and 60s era, suburban LA as being very, kind of white bread, and kind of a pejorative kind of sense. But we had a lot of different kinds of friends, and it was a really fun place to grow up.
Yeah. Did you sort of become a standout in grade school because your dad worked on Disney films, or was that not a big deal?
No, really not so much. Again, we were just kind of saying the same thing over and over again, but really our lives were very ordinary in that respect. And, when I started working a little bit and was doing voice recording, as we'll get into later, there'd be times when I'd come out of school and Mom would come to pick me up at, 10 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the math class or something. And that would turn some heads as I walked out, but nobody was really all that curious about it. And honestly, I've had the experience a number of times now. Clearly, I'm much, much older than I was then. Many of my friends have had kids, and other people will introduce me, to their children as the voice of Mowgli or the voice of Christopher Robin in Winnie the Pooh. And the kids don't really quite get it anyway, So I think that a lot of my schoolmates had no idea where I was headed, but it wasn't any different than getting pulled out for a dental appointment or,
sure.
It wasn't quite as bad as getting sent to the principal's office, but it was something in that same vein where you were just gone for a few hours, and then the next day you get on first base, man. We got a softball game to play.
So let's go to the natural thing of how did you become a voice actor to begin with? I mean, was that something you wanted to do? Was it your dad's idea to say, hey, why don't you audition for this?
I think up until the point that I began to be thought of by my father, who was a director at that time, Willie could sort of sense that there was a potential for me to do this kind of work. And prior to the this is probably, what is it going to be, 55, 65? It's going to be 1963 or 2, something like that. I'd be 7, 8 years old. Prior to that time, they had tended to go for kids' voices that had Hollywood pedigrees, that were sort of kid actors, that took that craft very seriously, even as a young person, and who may have from a very young age really wanted to become an actor, and that's a commitment. It's an investment as a kid to become an actor, and it is therefore a commitment that you don't just fall into it. You really have to want it. And in my case, I found it kind of interesting and fun to go do, but I didn't latch onto it so much that it became an opportunity for me to kind of pursue that as a profession. Other kids prior to my time, I think, more the case. So you tended to have kids that had chops as an actor, that had actual kind of maybe even some training. They went to classes. By the time I came along, especially for the role of Christopher Robin, it was really important that there was a certain innocence about the role that didn't infer professional training, that didn't infer, kind of an affectation of cuteness or overly sweetness or, maybe trying too hard. Not that other kids did do that, but it's hard to act normal. It's hard to act innocent, right? I mean, you either are or you aren't, especially as a child. And so I think that was part of what, effectively, I think I got the job because I couldn't act worth a darn and I could barely carry a tune. And those two things together sort of made me appropriate for this innocent little boy who still lives in a world of fantasy with his childhood toys. And then just a couple of years later on, as the role of Mowgli became available to me, and I can tell you more of a story about that. Again, I think the voice of Mowgli at that point, it was just really needed in a movie that was so full of these great big personalities. The boy just needed to be as simple, as kind of pure or something.
Authentic.
Authentic. Yeah, certainly authentic. Yeah. In terms of like how much razzle dazzle, that movie did not need any more razzle dazzle from the Mowgli character, right? It had personalities left and right that were really vivid and wonderful and entertaining. And yet the story of the Jungle Book, as such as it is really quite simple. And it all involves the boy. And so that role had to be chosen, the casting for that role had to be chosen rather carefully. And they decided to look for somebody like me that didn't have a whole lot of acting experience in order to bring that kind of authenticity to the role.
And I mean, Jungle Book was really the last picture Walt had a hand in. Did he have to approve you as the voice of Mowgli, or was that just left to the filmmakers?
Well, yeah, so we can get into this, that kind of, my dad used to call it the mishmash of animation credits, and it is really hard to determine sometimes who's actually responsible for what you see on the finished screen, because so many people have so much to do with those decisions all along the way. But by the time the Jungle Book came along, my dad, Wooly, had directed The Sword and the Stone prior to this movie, all on his own, which isn't to say he didn't have help, but Walt was involved with other things. He was very busy with other projects. Disneyland was going great guns. They were even beginning to think already in those early stages of Disney World. They had a bunch of other, and the weekly television programs were a tremendous load on Walt as well. So Wooly, my dad, had already become a director with extraordinary power or authority to push a film in a certain direction, because up until that point, all the other directors that had directed animated features prior to that time, they'd all worked with Walt, and would always have not only the last word, of course, would have a lot to do with shaping the film as it went along, shaping the story and the casting. Well, that was the case to a great degree with the Jungle Book, but by that point, My dad, Willie, was really much more in the driver's seat. Walt was still editing in a really visionary kind of way that only Walt Disney could do. He had some great casting suggestions, and he had some ideas for story points that helped the guys move the project forward. But I'm sure Walt approved every last little thing, but he found my voice, I think, pretty appealing. And I can explain that a little bit if I can just tell you a little bit of a story about how that came to pass. So if I'm 7 years old in 1967, or maybe let's say I'm 8 years old in 68, and I'm doing Winnie the Pooh, and I have this voice of an 8-year-old, right? I mean, I'm just a little baby kid. And the Mowgli character is really much more of a teenager. He's really much more of a Dennis the Menace kind of character than, or almost not even Macaulay Culkin, but, Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone, he played an older kind of a kid, but not so for Winnie the Pooh. And so by the time they got to the Jungle Book, they realized that they needed a voice, and they started working with other young actors and actually recorded some dialogue and started working with them. But over time, one problem with these movies is it takes a very long time to make them. It takes 3.5, 4 years to make them. So you start with a kid that has a voice like this, and he's 11 and a half years old. And then, 2.5 years later, he comes back to finish his dialogue recording, and he's got a voice that makes him sound like Sinbad the Sailor, and he's got a full beard and has just grown up. And so that became one of the problems they had to fix. And then I think they also just wanted to go for a voice that the deeper they got into creating the story and developing the animation and understanding the relationships between these characters, they needed a voice that had just that right touch of innocence, or lines like, "But I don't want to go back to the man village," becomes in the voice of a teenager, "But I don't want to go back to the man village." It becomes more petulant, more teenager-like. This needed to be a child who was discovering both himself as an adolescent and as a man cub, as a person in the middle of the jungle, as opposed to a teenager who's trying to tear himself away from something teenagers just have a whole different way of looking at the world, and that was too old of a voice for that role. So once again, it was fortuitous. If you're asking me if I got this role based on my talent, the answer is only a very, very little bit, because they were really looking for someone who could just barely carry a tune and could act with a great degree of that youthful authenticity that's so important for that role.
Yeah, they wanted that innocence, really, and that's what it was. And like you said, that's what they were looking for and needed for the picture, because they did have all of those big talents involved, Louis Prima and
Bill Harris,
Bill Harris,
Sterling Holloway, Sebastian Cabot.
Yeah,
George Saunders at the end, Shere Khan, the voice of Shere Khan. It's a remarkable movie because it does have such a delicate story. It's all about Mowgli and whether or not he's going to go back to the man village. And then these episodes occur that could almost be put in a different order, and it wouldn't change the nature of the story too much. To my way of thinking, it's a lot like Mary Poppins, which was tremendously successful for the studio and had come out just 2 years before 2 years before they started development of the Jungle Book. And it was fresh in Walt's mind, I think. And I think at the point they were struggling with keeping these animated features at a price point in terms of production costs that was modest enough that you didn't risk losing the whole studio because you spent all this money making it and then you didn't make any. And that, it's really hard to judge those things, how an audience is going to respond. And so they're looking for ways of saving money and making things a little more simple, a little more elegant. The process of feature animation storytelling through the whole course of Walt's remarkable history with that had been not complicated so much as complex. There's a tremendous evolution in the course of making every single one of these films, where they started from a place of, we've got this idea. It's going to be about this thing called Peter Pan. And we know that there's a book and there's a stage play. But in many ways, that's not enough for our film. We have to make it a Disney film. Now, how do we make that almost from whole cloth? We've got a very simple idea. We kind of know the color. We kind of know the tone. But in order for it to feel like a Disney film, we're going to almost have to make it from the bottom up. And I think it was determined relatively early on that we're not going to make it too difficult to follow what's happening when. It's really about having Mowgli's journey through the jungle give us an excuse, a wonderful excuse, a delightful narrative filmmaking excuse to add people, characters, animals in this case, doing interesting things. If you compare it again to Mary Poppins, I mean, when you think about Mary Poppins, and many of your listeners will be very familiar with that film, I would suggest to you that, again, the order of sequences in that film is not so important. Whether or not you're laughing so hard that you're on the ceiling, or dancing on the rooftops, or singing Tuppence a Bag outside the steps of St. Paul with an old woman who's feeding the birds. Those individual things could be rearranged in a way, and it might not really have that big of an effect. But each of them individually are so powerful that you almost need for them to not be the human mind can't do too much all at once. It can't follow a complicated narrative thread and listen to great music, watch amazing performances, enjoy themselves in a way that's sort of out of time in a way. You know, stories kind of, in some ways, a plot is by definition taking steps forward into things that change, usually with surprises along the way for the major characters. And these movies need to kind of let you settle in a little bit and just listen and enjoy.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you got selected to do the voice of Mowgli, how many times did you go into the recording booth? And I take it the recording was on stage A or B over at the Disney Studios, where they did all their voice recording. Did you record with any of the other actors?
Yeah. So to start with, actually, in the very early days with recording Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, I was part of a large audition. I remember going down to the studio on what might have been a Saturday morning or something, and boy, the place was packed. There was just several dozen kids were auditioning. So somehow or other, I managed to make it through that. Little nepotism perhaps involved. And in the case of my dad, knowing that I was easy to work with, that was that particular situation. And then I got kind of used to how this worked. And then obviously when I got to the Jungle Book, there was more dialogue to record and more days at the studio. They were both very similar for me, as they were for virtually any voice talent that was recorded at the studio. All the way up until relatively recently, which was that you did go to one of the two biggest sound studios. The A studio could accommodate a good-sized orchestra, right? That's where all the scores were recorded. And so it's a big space. And it also had the state-of-the-art equipment in it. If it was available, why wouldn't you record in the best room with the best gear and the best engineers and all that stuff? And so that all seems like a great idea if you're the filmmaker. If you're the little boy who's walking into this room that's the size of not quite a basketball arena, at high school or something.
But it's like a gymnasium size.
Yeah, it's like a small gymnasium, or like a big gymnasium at a YMCA or the city parks and rec. It's a pretty big space, and it's all kind of empty, or it's set up with, there's some easels where the guys would put their sheet music if they were recording some orchestral stuff. There's a great big grand piano under a quilted mat in the middle of the room that was used for different sorts of things when you're working with people who are singing. And there's one whopping big microphone on this huge long boom, this big bar that goes over the top of a post, and you can wheel that around and use it like an arm to lower the microphone into an appropriate place. It wasn't just a simple microphone on a stand. It was a microphone about the size of a loaf of bread, as I recall it now. It was a giant microphone, and it was lowered right down in front of your face. And you have headphones on so that you can hear instructions from the booth where there are half a dozen people. My dad would be there. Maybe an animator would be there, an assistant director, and a couple of engineers, a social worker to make sure that they didn't overwork the poor little kids like me that were effectively child labor. And you'd be in that room, and you'd get to the little. You had to walk through the engineering booth to get into the sound studio, and you'd go out there, and it was very quiet. I mean, those walls are built like, I don't know what, like imagine a line or something. They must be 3 feet thick. And when you walk into the room from the little busy engineering booth where there might be half a dozen people kind of chit-chatting, you walk into the other place and it's quiet, Then you've got one or two people there and they get you set up, and the engineer adjusts a few things and they could put a light out, and maybe an administrative person comes in with some sheets of paper that are stapled to pieces of cardboard so that you can read your lines as you go through. And boy, when everybody leaves the room and they walk back into the engineering booth and they close this door behind them, it's a little bit like a cross between the door on a big industrial refrigerator and that on a vault in a bank. I mean, it's about 8 inches thick, right? And when it clicks shut, it's like being inside a launch tube on a submarine. It's just like, yeah, there's nothing that you hear except the sound of your own little beating heart.
And just for our listeners' sake, I'm going to take it a step further. It's dead. The sound is dead in a room like that. There's no reverberation. There's no echo. It's so padded that you can talk, but you will not hear an echo. You won't hear any sound bounce, if you will.
Absolutely true. Yeah. So not only is it there's no extraneous noises, it's just you, but you can't even your voice sounds different because you're just enveloped in this sense of dead, is the word you used, which is exactly right from an audio standpoint, but it's sort of emptiness. You're just like in the middle of this really sonically empty space, emotionally rather isolating too. And, all of that is fine. You get used to that pretty quickly. It's not like it's a scary environment, but it is definitely one where you realize as a 7-year-old that you're going to have to pay attention here, and you're going to have to do your best, because as much as you want a kid to have, kind of a happy, casual, relaxed kind of feeling, so that they can have a performance that's, that's appealing, that's warm. You go over a certain line like, I don't know, but what do you want a balloon for? Or tut tut, it looks like rain. Or attaboy, Eeyore, try swishing it. You say one of those lines 15 times or 20 before they're happy with it in the booth. And by the time they get to the fourth one, and that means you've done 35, 40 lines on other lines to begin with, you come to an understanding that this is, no, I gotta bring my game to every single one of these readings. And it's important. And in the early days with my dad, he would do most of the directing from the booth. And if there was someone in the room with me, standing next to me, sometimes because we rarely recorded with other voice talent at the same time, he would stand next to me sometimes. And if there were a dialogue between me and Baloo, for example, he would read Baloo's lines so that I had something to kind of launch my understanding of what my response would be. And he would do that during Winnie the Pooh when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. As we begin to start with Mowgli and I began to be a teenager, I think it was a deliberate choice on his part that I work more with Larry Clemens, one of the writers, the primary writer on that movie. I think almost because my dad felt that it might be more difficult for a father to coach his son, as it were, than for somebody who wasn't as tied into it. And I got along great with my dad. He was great at giving me instructions, and he'd help me with homework and sports, and was very encouraging. It wasn't like there was a problem there, but I think he actually came to the conclusion that it might be better just to keep it a little less fraught.
Yeah, I was gonna say, was it because you were becoming a teen and you were sort of pushing boundaries a little bit that maybe he wanted to insert somebody else so that it wasn't the father-son relationship, but it was a voice actor and a professional writer, director, whatever you want to call the guy directing the voice session, and that made it easier for both of you.
I think that's exactly right. It just professionalized it a little bit more and took some of the personality or the personalization of it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should just mention one other quick thing, which was that in order to prepare, especially for a young kid, this is so important. Recording dialogue in that way is almost like in modern movies. Now everybody's familiar with how this works. If you have a sword fight in outer space, you do it against what's called a green screen, right? Or if you're fighting off a dragon or a gigantic robot or something, that robot may not be in the room with you, and you have to somehow, as an actor, figure out how to swing your sword or throw your projectile or whatever it is. You have to figure out how to act in a room where you don't have the other actors really with you, because they don't exist in the real world. They only exist in the computer-generated one. And there's a little bit of an analog there when you're doing animation, and that the animation has not been developed yet. There's no animation you can watch in terms of a final film that has a flow to it, a temporal flow. But there is a bunch of story art that you can look at, which is by the time you get into the recording booth, rendered on what are called storyboards. And it was a device that Walt and his crew perfected. It was an idea that had been around in Hollywood a little bit before that. But when Walt came up with this idea that they're going to start doing feature-length animated films, they had to think them through very thoroughly, or they would waste too much money drawing stuff that wasn't going to ultimately be used in the film. You can't know a lot of that until you really think it through, not with words on a page and not with people telling you how great the movie's going to be. You actually need to see art. He thought of films as works of art conceived by artists, and words can be part of that, and scripts were often, a preliminary piece of how you kind of put that narrative thread together. But very quickly, he needed to see little 4x4 sheets of paper, typically, literally like a cocktail napkin, with these remarkably done drawings or sometimes felt pen, something that was very quickly drawn, quickly rendered, and there'd be a 4x8 foot long cork bulletin board, and these things would be pinned up to it, and there'd be sometimes a little line of narration underneath it, and you'd roll in there at 10:15 on a Thursday morning, and the next 40 minutes you'd be sitting there with a cup of hot cocoa and a couple people effectively reading you this amazing comic book that's right there in front of you, and they just point to each frame, and then it's like, and then Baloo says, "I'm sorry, Mowgli, I gotta take you back to the Man Village." And then Mowgli says, "Man Village? I thought I could trust you." And then, they sort of read you through the entire world of the story so that when you come to actually say something, you have that as a context and your performance can be richer as a result of it.
They're essentially acting out a sequence in front of you. And you've got your cup of hot chocolate and your cigarette, and you're intently watching this, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a scene right out of Roger Rabbit.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just put a little sharper point on that, if I may, which is to suggest that when they're describing this stuff, in the same way that it's kind of the cliche bit of bad work on the part of a director to say, no, I don't want you to say it like that. Why don't you try saying it like this? Ba 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 ba. Well, most actors will find that not very helpful because they need to be saying this as if it's it's coming out of them, not you. Yeah. And they have to be saying it as if it's coming out of the character, the personality that they've embraced, they've adopted, they've incorporated into their performance. So hearing you say how you want that person to say the line, is they have to find that person's voice, and they can't be led too much by you. So in general, yes, they give you some readings, they're called, where somebody sort of suggests, obviously you're going to be, what? You've betrayed me. You're not going to say that just in a very calm voice. Obviously, you're going to have to understand the emotions behind it and emote those into the microphone. But it's really giving you a sense of story. So much of Disney animation is built on the idea that every frame has an element of sincerity to it. When you look at the drawing, you understand it. When you look at the characters, you empathize with them, not just understand what they're saying, but you actually understand what they want and what they mean. And the performances, the voice performances are a huge part of that, as is the music. I mean, to be honest, choose the work of Richard and Robert Sherman on The Jungle Book and many other Disney features, as well as all the orchestration and all those things, have this element of sincerity where this is really a remarkable thing to me, animation is an incredible magic trick. It is a deceit. It's a deception that you're looking at the screen for an hour and a half, imagining this to be a real world that exists. You're being lied to effectively. And yet, in order for that to be enjoyable and positive, not bad, to be entertaining, you have to trust every single frame of it. If the magician muffs a trick and shows you reveals the trick that he had tucked up his sleeve, you won't believe anything that happens for the rest of the performance because, I know now it's a trick. I know you've tricked me, and now I'm going to be on my guard. The key with animation is to, from the very beginning, bring people into this world of fantasy where they can willingly give themselves to it. They can fly over the cityscape of London with Peter Pan. They can walk through the forest with Mowgli in the Jungle Book. They can, They can do battle with a gigantic dragon that's preventing them from getting to their true love that lives in the castle where Sleeping Beauty rests. All those things are really quite magical, and Disney Animation did them in a way that, to my mind, no other studio has managed until relatively recently, when Pixar and DreamWorks and a couple of other companies have managed to do a pretty good job of catching up.
I think that was very well said, by the way. I do want to ask you, was Mowgli and Christopher Robin it for you as a voice actor, or did you go out on auditions for other things and maybe you didn't get it, or, did you audition for anything else at Disney?
Effectively, I did not do anything else. I actually was, I think my voice is one of the kids in the background chorus singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic in the Lincoln, what's it called? A Night with Lincoln, the thing at Disneyland.
Mr. Lincoln, right? I mean,
Evening with Mr. Lincoln, whatever it is. The deal that's right there on Main Street that was the first real convincing use of animatronics. And there's some background. So anyway, that's my other big claim to fame, is that I performed in one of the Disneyland rides. But beyond that, the answer to your question is no. And again, that goes back to, I think, my parents' understanding that to be a child actor, you really have to want it. And so if Bruce wants it, he'll ask for it. It wasn't like I was, they probably knew me well enough to know that I had no trouble asking for a lot of things as a little kid. And that if I'd really wanted to do it, they would have been happy to have helped me do that in the way they helped me do everything else. But I think they understood that it's a life you have to really want as a child, or it can be a perilous one, right? It can be one that ends up where you're not quite as happy as you thought you were.
And I mean, Hollywood is littered with those terrible stories. I mean, Bobby Driscoll, just take that one. There's so many child actors where it just didn't end well for them.
Yeah, and then I think we're all aware of those and the tragedy that we associate with them. There are a number of people who had wonderful childhoods. Look at guys like Ron and Clint Howard, who had terrific, so it doesn't necessarily have to turn out bad, but it can turn it, as I suggested before, it's kind of serious business. And if you're 11 years old and now you're involved in a very adult world where it's kind of serious business, it's just, there's a lot to deal with as a youngster, and many people do it really well. And boy, congratulations to them. Boy, there's some young actors that have just done remarkable jobs. But in my case, I didn't have that need, that desire to be good at performing, and so I didn't.
But it did lead you into filmmaking.
Yeah, well, I hesitated at the end of what I just said there before I buttoned off that sentence, because I was thinking to myself, well, I have gone on to have a itch and a desire and a real enjoyment for entertaining people, although I haven't done so much of it in front of the camera. I guess that's the distinction. So, I don't know, is that the case? Are filmmakers just, are we, people who wish we could have become actors, but we don't have the courage or the talent to do so? I don't know.
I don't think that's the case, but I think we are bumping up against the clock for this week. And so what I'd like to do is come back next week and pick up on that and start talking about how you got into being a documentary filmmaker, because certainly Disney was a hotbed of documentary film, especially nature documentaries. So we'll come back and talk about that next week. So with that, I'm going to say, Bruce, thank you for being on the Skull Rock podcast.
It has been wonderful so far. I look forward to coming back soon.
Skull Rock Podcast is now on Patreon. Dive deeper into the world of animation, films, and behind-the-scenes stories with your hosts, Aljon Go and Dave Bossert. Not only will you be helping to keep the magic alive, but you will be part of our special community with ad-free episodes. We want to thank friend of the show, Joshua Volkert, as well as Skull Rock crew members, Steve Minch and Chris Banis, for their support. If you would like to join our Skull Rock crew, please visit our Patreon link in our show notes or visit patreon.com/Skull Rock Podcast. Thank you for listening and for your continued support of everything we do.
Skull Rock Podcast, where you hear the stories behind the adventures.
Let's get out of here!
Come on, Scotty, let's get out of here.
Let's get out of here. Let's get out of here! Let's get out of here, Lieutenant.
As Dave said, if you want more, check it out. It's all there at skullrockpodcast.com, We encourage you to check that out. Also, be sure to like us, share us, subscribe to us on YouTube. That is a great place for everyone to check out the Vault shows as well. And you can even interact with us and leave us those comments. We do encourage that. Follow us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, LinkedIn. Dave and I are both on there. You can send us those notes as well. And we would appreciate you writing those emails, Dave@skullrockpodcast.com or Aljon, ALJON, at skullrockpodcast.com. Quick shout out to our friends at Sorcerer Radio at srsounds.com. All Disney music all day long. You can also follow me on Instagram at AljonGo, and our other podcast with myself and my wife, Kristen Hetzel and Kat Arcori. It's called Dining at Disney. We drop a show every single week talking about the theme parks and Disney food. Once again, Dining at Disney on everywhere you find podcasts. Dave?
Yeah, and as always, you can check me out on the Tunes Behind the Tunes on Sirius XM, Disney Hits, Channel 133. Any of my books are available at theoldmillpress.com. You can also go to my website, davidbossert.com, for all kinds of free content and free stuff that you can mail away for. So with that, Aljon, I'm going to say, go out and have a fantastic week. We'll be back here next week with a brand new interview. So with that, go out, have a fantastic week. We will talk to you next week right here on the Skull Rock Podcast.